The views expressed in this interview are those of the individuals and do not reflect the official policy or position of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, the U.S. Navy, or the Naval Postgraduate School. Welcome to the Trident Room, brewer of stout conversation, unfiltered and on tap.
Part 1 of a two-part episode.
Today's guest is Rear Admiral Mattis. A native of Fullerton, California, Admiral Mattis graduated with distinction from the U.S. Naval Academy and went on to study as a Fitzgerald Scholar at Oxford. Over his career, he has served as a submariner, a nuclear engineer, a ballistic missile officer, and later as a leader in the space and information warfare. He has commanded at sea, supported civil military operations in Iraq, and led Navy relief efforts in Los Angeles during the COVID-19 pandemic. Most recently, he set up Navy Space Command as its director and now serves as director of strategic effects for U.S. Naval Forces Europe and Africa, and as commander of Task Force 66. His career reflects the Navy's evolution across undersea, space, and information domains, and the human dimension of leadership across them all. Admiral Mattis, it's an honor to have you with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to be here and looking forward to the interview. Fantastic day in Monterey, California. Really appreciate you getting the weather right and fantastic to be a part of the graduation ceremony today.
Yeah, excellent, sir. Appreciate it. Yeah, it was a warm day for us Montereyans. Anything really above 70 is extremely hot for us. So I think maybe you brought the weather from Europe over there. From your background, looking at your bio, my understanding is you grew up in Fullerton, California. And to be honest, I don't know much about Fullerton, even though I am a native Californian. Was born in Santa Barbara, grew up down there in the south there. So I did a little deep dive in Fullerton, and I found some really interesting things. I didn't realize it was a place for pretty surprising creative energy. I didn't know Leo Fender built the Telecaster guitar there. Apparently there's a vibrant music scene that launched bands like Social Distortion and The Offspring. It seems to be an environment of innovation and artistry, and I'm just curious how that shaped, if at all, your creativity, leadership, or perhaps risk-taking.
Yeah, great question. And just to get after a little bit more than Fullerton, I was born in Fullerton. I grew up in a town next to Fullerton called Yorba Linda, California, home of Richard Nixon. A little more rural than Fullerton was at the time. And then later in my life, moved back to Fullerton. I went to high school in Fullerton and sort of consider Fullerton where I've grown up and certainly where I've lived since I've come back from my time in the Navy there. And in high school, growing up in Fullerton as well. But it's funny you mentioned a couple of these things. First off, yes, definitely creative environment. Fullerton was a town that was founded by the guy who put the train station between San Diego and Los Angeles. His name was Mr. Fullerton, and because they put the train station there, the city bloomed. It's a cool city in that it's got an internal area that is residential and sort of light commercial, and then it's all schools and colleges. And Fullerton's got like 6 colleges in it. It's really incredible. And then outside of it, it's surrounded by a ring of increasingly mid to heavy industrial. So it almost has a little bubble inside that kind of creates this Narnia-like interior that's really good. And it's got a whole variety of socioeconomic angles to it. I mean, again, you go south across the tracks. It really is south across the tracks. And there's other parts that are very well off. But it's really been a blend. It's got an old traditional downtown, an old Fox Theater that's still there, and a whole series of really authentic bars and restaurants that defy all of commercial places that you see everywhere else. There's none of those standard restaurants there. So it's a great place to grow up. And then again, with respect to risk-taking, most of my risk-taking grew up out of Yorba Linda. Again, really rural area. Walked a couple miles to school, hung out in dry lake bed, riding bikes in there and playing Cowboys and Indians or Soldier or whatever else, run around the lake bed. It was also the early to mid 1980s where we were all latchkey kids. Our parents just would expect us to be home by dusk. And as long as you had a bike, you could literally get anywhere. It was in many ways kind of like you see, forgetting what the name of the Netflix series is.
Stranger Things?
Stranger Things. I resonate greatly with Stranger Things because that really was my childhood.
And you also fought against a multinational entity.
No, we had no alien or supernatural forces going on, but we did in our own imagination believe we had those kinds of things. So yeah, Fullerton was fantastic that way. It's funny you mentioned Social Distortion. I grew up playing water polo solo with a teammate whose brother was on the Social Distortion
wow.
band. These were just local bands that we knew and that were part of my young adulthood. I'll just put it that way. It was a great environment to grow up in. I really loved it.
These are just a small fraction of the musicians that I saw. My understanding is Jackson Brown also came from Fullerton, I think.
I didn't know that, actually.
I think that's what I saw. No, Wikipedia could be wrong. I didn't follow the sources, but I think that's what I saw.
I do know that Gwen Stefani was literally born at the same hospital the same day that my brother was born.
Wow.
Again, a local band that we grew up knowing. It was pretty cool.
That's pretty amazing. From Fullerton, then you went to Annapolis and then to Oxford. Quite a journey from all of that. What was most surprising in the difference between Annapolis and Oxford, and how did that train your mind, those differences? And do you still have Annapolis and Oxford traditions living inside of you, guiding your thought processes?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. They couldn't be more different in ways of learning. Annapolis is really about showing up and putting in the time and energy to grind through problems. And you need to focus on the things that you are being guided to by your professors and driven to really learn and understand. And I appreciate my Annapolis education tremendously. I did not get into the Naval Academy straight out of high school. I had to do 6 months of prep school and 6 months of junior college before I got in. And so by the time I got to Naval Academy, I was very well prepared to be a good student. I'd gotten rid of all my bad habits from high school, and I had really was able to focus pretty hard. When I got to Annapolis, I found the curriculum to be really straightforward, the professors to be really open to teaching material in a very clear and concise way, and having lots of extra instruction availability if I need it, small classrooms, good instructors, and a great learning environment. Annapolis is challenging for most people because they don't know how to time manage and they don't know how to balance all the loads that you have across. Again, a little bit because I had done that prep school year, I was a little better prepared in those areas, and I was pretty serious about my education at the Naval Academy. So I found the Naval Academy to be a very straightforward learning environment. It did require putting in the time, and I spent most weekends in studying to try and really get ahead of the game and not fall behind, because once you fell behind, it was really, really rough. What I discovered early on, though, was that I was doing very well academically at the academy, and I had a lot of classmates who were not, and I needed to spend time tutoring them to get better at the things. So what I offered when I was at the academy was that if I would take in a class, I would offer a weekly tutorial on that class. And actually, that was one of the secrets to my success, was that if you can teach something, it means you really know something. And because I was under a lot of pressure to be able to share what I was learning and my academic success with others, it actually rewarded me with being even better at it, because I forced myself to learn how to teach it. And then once you know how to teach it, you know how to learn it. And so again, very guided journey, very straightforward. I learned to master that by putting in extra time. And then I did even one step better by learning to share it with others, which made me even better at it. So it was a great process. Oxford couldn't be more different. Oxford, Cambridge used the tutorial system. And the tutorial system is one really of exploration and growing through an intellectual journey that you and your tutor put out to discover together. And I'll go back a little bit. I was a little bit of an anomaly at the Naval Academy, in that I did a Trident Scholar, the senior thesis program. There's usually about a dozen Trident Scholars.
And what is that?
It was basically independent research project. I was, interestingly, although I was recruited very hard by the math department to be a math major, I knew I was going to do a math and engineering for my entire career in the Navy. It was just an inevitability given the realities of naval warfare. So I chose to do English, which is something that I wasn't great at. Growing up, I had a minor form of dyslexia called cross dominance. I was very late to read. When I got it down, I really got it down, and I picked things up fast. I went from being in remedial classes in 5th grade to being in like gifted classes in 7th grade. But it was all about hard work. What I discovered on that journey of learning is that if you put in the time, you can really master something. And because of the way my brain works, I have a very disciplined way that I'll load information in my brain. Oxford challenged all of that. And the tutorial system at Oxford is one where you literally go on an intellectual journey with your professor, and they will guide you through a different approach. Now, I did well enough at the Naval Academy that I found myself with this Trident Scholar program, and I could pick my subject. And turned out when I was a third class midshipman, I did a Shakespeare course with a very renowned Naval Academy professor who was just phenomenal, Professor Jasperson, in teaching this Shakespeare course.
Sounds like a professor whose domain would be Shakespeare. Jasperson, I love that.
Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, he was a retired naval officer, and his parents were in the 1920s very well known as sort of the beautiful couple in Annapolis. So he grew up essentially with I think his father was a Naval Academy graduate, and his mother were well known in Navy circles. And as a result, he did not go to the Naval Academy to try and get away from them. Still became a surface warfare officer, but ended up getting a history degree, and then somehow ending up teaching English at the Naval Academy. Anyways, I fell in love with Shakespeare taking his course as a sophomore, a youngster at the Naval Academy. And then I was interested in doing some senior research projects. I got paired up with a biblical scholar that he knew. I did some Bible scholarship my second class year. And then for my Trident scholarship, I actually proposed a combination of my love for Shakespeare and my love for the Bible, which was a combination. It was really how was Shakespeare influenced by the Bible and how did that play out in some of his history plays, particularly Richard II, Henry IV, Part 1, Henry IV, Part 2, and Henry V, which is known as the Henry Ad. It's sort of the second history play series that Shakespeare did. And it has a biblical narrative in it. And I studied that as my senior thesis project at the Naval Academy as a Trident scholar. To me, it wasn't genius study work. It was a lot of hard work by me. Again, everyone at the Naval Academy is more of an engineer than they are a history major. I think I took 85 credits of engineering and like 40 credits of English to graduate with a Bachelor of Science in English from the Naval Academy. But what it did do is it set me up with this love for learning Shakespeare and where Shakespeare is influenced from. And when I went to Oxford, I immediately wanted to study medieval and Shakespearean drama as a result of that, which is the area I focused at Oxford. And I had an opportunity, and again, I won a scholarship out of the Naval Academy to go study at Oxford. Today, they would never let you go off and do something as useless as studying medieval and Shakespearean drama. But at the time, I convinced the Navy that I would come back and teach that at the Naval Academy, and that seemed to check the box. I never did that, so I got away with it somehow. But when I got to Oxford, one of the core reference materials I used at the Naval Academy in my senior thesis project was this book called The Origins of Shakespeare by Emrys Jones. And Emrys was actually one of C.S. Lewis's final star students at Cambridge, had managed to see every Olivier Shakespeare play on the stage in London in the 1950s. I mean, incredible. When I was studying under him, and he was my tutor, if you will, out of New College, Oxford. I was at University College, but when you're a graduate student in Oxford, you go to whatever college you can for the expertise you need. And Emrys...
Sorry, it's a college system, right? Oxford is the title, but there's a lot of like little colleges, right?
That's right. There's 30 plus colleges there now. They keep growing. I think there was about 36 when I was there. They're maybe up to 40 now. And each college is its own little university environment. And if you're an undergraduate, you do all your work in college. If you're a graduate student, they have they call a middle common room where there's usually between, 10 and 50 graduate students. And the graduate students are really federated by the academic departments, which are sort of overlaid across all of the colleges. And different colleges will have generally instructors from all the departments, but you can sort of pick and choose based on your academic field. So because I was doing a Master of Philosophy degree in English, I was able to specialize in two particular periods, Renaissance or Renaissance, the British pronounce it Renaissance, and then also the medieval period. And then because I was focused on Shakespeare and Shakespeare's influence from the Middle Ages, I really sort of focused on medieval drama and how that influenced Shakespeare with respect to the Shakespearean drama and that era of Renaissance drama in England. So,
I don't mean to interrupt that. I'm just more curious, like, how do you choose your professor, or do they choose you, or it's kind of like back and forth where you kind of figure each other out?
It's one of those things where, depending on what you specialize in, your professor has specialties that they pair you with. You don't necessarily choose them, you get kind of told them. But again, as you're taking courses, there's these tutors. Interestingly enough, I had literally based my senior thesis project at the Naval Academy on this professor's book. I did not know that I was going to get paired with him when I got to Oxford. It was a happy coincidence that I did. And I'll just mention to the audience here, if you ever get the opportunity, there's an Al Pacino movie out there called Searching for Richard. I take it that Al Pacino was trying to do a Richard III Shakespeare movie, got about halfway through it and realized he couldn't pull it off, and he turned it into a documentary. And in the documentary, he ends up interviewing Emrys Jones, and actually Emrys Jones' wife, a woman named Barbara Everett. She's also a Shakespeare scholar and a T.S. Eliot scholar. I had the privilege of studying under both of them at Oxford. And Emrys is no longer with us. I don't know that Barbara is either at this point. but they were an amazing intellectual pair to study under, just giants in their field, and really drove the love for the subject for me. And just the opportunity to study with them was incredible. It was a dream come true. But in contrast to Annapolis, going back to your question, the reason it got so interesting was you took this journey and you drove it where you wanted to drive it. And so I literally chose my own adventure and did a deeper dive on all the things that I did as a midshipman, looking at Shakespeare in the Bible and the influences of Shakespeare in the Bible, and was really trying to understand, did I get it right in that thesis paper or not? Ultimately, what I discovered was, particularly around the English language and literature studies at the time, and this was early to mid 1990s, is there was a lot of garbage out there, in my opinion, on how people looked at this stuff. I was blessed to get to study with folks like Amaris and Barbara and get old school training on it. I also had an amazing professor of, literally studied with the J.R. Tolkien Chair of Medieval Drama at Magdalen College, Oxford as well, another just esteemed scholar. So I was able to sort of stick with those very traditional academic thinkers and stay away from the fads, the Marxist, feminist kind of stuff that was a little less interesting to me, although it was very fad in the community. I went to Oxford thinking maybe I wanted to, at some point, write books and teach English. I walked away from Oxford loving English language and literature and never wanting to teach it or go into the business of it, because I found that it was quite polluted with a lot of crazy ideas. But I had really enjoyed some old school professors who really managed to teach it to me well. And it's remained a very vibrant hobby in my life. I love seeing Shakespeare plays, and I love reading poetry and sort of reflecting. It's one way of sort of refuel my bank. And again, Shakespeare, T.S. Eliot. It sounds crazy, but Barbara really showed me the connection between those two things, and I've just loved it ever since. So Oxford was a choose your own adventure in a way that I never imagined. I'm going to claim that I was the first student in Oxford to bring a laptop to a lecture and type my notes in. They didn't exist before me, but most essays were handwritten and then read to your professors back then. And we're talking 20, 30-page essays. I typed mine because my handwriting was so bad, and that's why I typed my notes as well. But it was a different era and really phenomenal. So amazing experience. And they managed to go from there to nuclear power school. So it was shock trauma going from one to the other.
Yeah. I just want to touch on a couple of different things. One, Al Pacino, I think he did a great job, and I want to say Merchant of Venice. That was, I think, a great movie, and I think he did a really good job in that role. I've never seen that film, though, and I'll have to definitely check that out. You brought up T.S. Eliot. I think this kind of goes back to this question that we're talking about. I listened to a interview with Walter Matthiessen, who wrote Jobs. I wrote Musk, different books too. But one of the questions the interview questioned him about, Lex Friedman, was, you're in New Orleans. Like, why did you choose to go back there? And it's funny, when he is talking about other things except New Orleans, it's a very different kind of intonation that he has. You could see, and I actually like watching the video, how he transforms a little bit. He talks about I'm not gonna do that New Orleans accent, but he talks about New Orleans, and you can see it change a little bit. And Lex Friedman asked him, like, where are you gonna go back to? And he actually brought up T.S. Eliot, Four Quartets. And the last one, for the listeners, it's a very small book, very dense, as all T.S. Eliot is, just all very dense. And I had to pull up a dictionary, and I'm like, I don't know, I have to read it again and again and again, trying to understand it. But there's, I think towards the end, the last one, I'm not giving anything away here, but the last poem talks about returning to the mouth of the river which you come from. And out of all these three, Fullerton, Annapolis, Oxford, which mouth of the river would you return back to?
Yeah, it's funny you asked that question, because in my tour currently in Europe, I have had the opportunity to spend a bit of time in Oxford. Again, I was just at the Naval Academy talking about the Black Sea and what's happened in the Black Sea with midshipmen there. And I actually have a house in Fullerton. My kids went to my old high school. Their teachers were actually people that I went to high school with. Their friends were children of people I went to high school with. To some degree, I say I go back to Fullerton. It really is where I grew up, where I came from. It's where people know me. It's what I know best and love best back there in Southern California. I do love Annapolis. I do love Oxford. They're two of my favorite places on earth for different reasons. I still feel uncomfortable on the campus of the Naval Academy, even as an admiral walking around. It's like somebody's going to tell me to stay away from the grass or do something. And Oxford is still a very incredibly vibrant place. Curiosity and creativity just exuding from it. So I love all three of those. I would love to go back to any of them at any time. But what do I truly consider home? That really goes back to Fullerton. Fullerton for me. I think that four quartets is spot on. And for people that are intimidated by Eliot, what I'd offer is there are some recordings out there of Eliot's own poems by Eliot. He has a very ominous voice. He speaks very slowly. It sounds like an old dying man to some degree. It must have been in his later years. But there's no better way to listen to Eliot than listen to Eliot reading Eliot and reading along with it. And I think you'll find that if you do that, you don't need to look in the dictionary. That the way he walks through those poems slowly, it adds verbal context to it. It's in the same way that watching a Shakespeare play versus reading Shakespeare is incredibly different. It is easy to understand a Shakespeare play as it is performed for you, even though you may not catch every word, every phrase, everything, and it feels like the language is very old. The reality is when you watch it or listen to it, it makes more sense than when you read it. And the same is true for Eliot's poetry. So I just offer, if anyone really wants to understand T.S. Eliot, go buy a CD of T.S. Eliot reading his own poetry and then read it along with that. It's my favorite way to read Eliot. It's the way I understand it most deeply. And I feel connected with the author in a whole nother level.
It's a recommendation, sir. For the audience, I think they'll probably ask, what's a CD? I'm just kidding.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah. Stream it. There you go. Sorry.
Yeah, some
Sorry.
Spotify or something.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
That's really funny. I want to hover on that just a little bit more. I like what you said in regards to listening to what he says. I haven't done that yet. I need to do that. But I like what you brought up in regards to Shakespeare plays, because whether it's in the movie form or seeing it on stage, it's very different. You can definitely understand it a lot more, especially when there's great actors performing it, on what exactly is happening in a scene. Because there's some, he's very funny, right? There's so many little bits that you catch and don't catch, not just his comedy, but there's so much stuff in there for that. And I feel that way about reading Chaucer out loud sometimes.
Yes.
Now, I don't understand Old Norse, but even reading like Beowulf out loud, you know what I mean?
I do.
And there's like something you can like get from that,
Yes.
just the way it comes out, and like, you capture something so much different. And I think my favorite translation for Beowulf is Seamus Heaney. I think he's a poet. I want to say Irish poet. And just going back and forth sometimes, you hold the book open and at least, for me, read out loud in Old Norse and then see what he says. And it's like, there's such a connection there that you have for that. And I think it goes back to the language and how some of this, and maybe goes back to biblical terms, were it was all translated orally, captured by word.
Yeah, what I didn't really explain in my thesis project back in the Naval Academy, and the reason I wanted to study medieval drama, was that the way that the medieval villagers of England understood the Bible was actually through drama. They had these medieval mystery plays. They were basically scenes from the Bible. And what you often see in Chaucer is translations in some ways of those mystery plays. And the way that they were done, again, you can think about how medieval society was organized, typically by trade unions. You'd have essentially one trade, that the carpenters, for example, were traditionally, they would always do the cross scene, because the cross was always something that you would have to build. Carpenters would have to build the cross. But you would have folks who put shoes on horses, for example, like the smiths. They would do another scene that was related to something there. And so typically the way that this was work is that everyone in a village would come out on the main street, on High Street generally, and they would sit on the dirt, but in our terms, the sidewalk. And then each of the trade unions would have a cart. And on that cart, they would have a scene from the Bible. It was like a float, and they would tell the biblical story float by float by float. So that traditionally around Easter, these holy periods, the carts would come by, and people who were illiterate didn't need to know how to read to understand the Bible. They could see it acted out in front of them. And so that's where much of this early English literature comes from, was these medieval mystery plays. There's 4 of these plays from different town series, that sequences of these plays that still exist. Townley was one of them. There's a couple others that I'm forgetting the names of now. It's been 30 plus years since I did all my research. Sitting on my shelf, I've got them all. But bottom line is, from them, some are fragments. You have full stories in other ones, but you see commonalities. And Shakespeare, as a young man growing up in Stratford-upon-Avon, would have seen these, and it formed his way of thinking about biblical narrative by story. And that story really is fall of man, redemption of man, and that sequence. And again, the whole point of my thesis was that those cycles come out in his story from Richard II, which is sort of the fall of a monarch in England due to his own vices, to essentially the second coming, if you will, which is Henry V coming back and bringing victory back to England out of heroic honor. And you see this cycle of biblical narrative through that. That was my thesis anyway. But again, it was why I wanted to study these things. But it does go back to your point. If there's multi-sensory ways that you can experience the language, listening, seeing, reading with your eyes, then it adds to the fullness of it. And when you're able to compare between the two, it's more meaningful as well. So again, that's why I really recommend is if you can listen to poetry, read it at the same time, follow through with it, it really adds to the robustness of it. I had to do that, again, a little personal tell here, because as I was trying to recover my way through my mild form of dyslexia, that was how multisensory understanding was how I really learned things well. And so I picked up on that technique early on because it was survival for me just to learn. But then what I learned later is that that's an incredible way to really gain deeper understanding and contextualization.
Thanks for joining us in the Trident Room. For more information about today's guests and topics, please visit the show notes online at nps.edu/Trident Room Podcast. The Trident Room Podcast has been brought to you by the Naval Postgraduate School Alumni Association and Foundation. For questions, comments, and suggestions, please email us at tridentroompodcasthost@nps.edu.